Picture this, it's 1983, West Germany. Police have received reports of suspicious activity coming from an old butcher shop in the town of Siegburg, so they go to investigate. Inside, they find 3 young men. They're surrounded by containers and equipment, and there are kilos of a mysterious white substance being produced inside what used to be a meat shop. Police confiscate it. Authorities order the men to stop production, and soon, the group finds themselves fighting the German government over their illicit operation. But they aren't making drugs or explosives, they're making tofu. Hi, hello, and welcome to another episode of True Crime Culinary, where we explore the strange intersection of food, history, and true crime. Before we dive in, just wanted to remind you that you can follow True Crime Culinary on Instagram and YouTube at True Crime Culinary, no spaces. There you will see images and videos of our episodes. I love posting pictures because sometimes the pictures are even stranger than the stories, so go check it out. Also, if you have stories or questions, you can always email me at truecrimeculinary@gmail.com. Now, on to biz. I am a fan of K-dramas. I also love Korean food, and as I emerged from my most recent, what did my husband call it? K-hole, aka 16 straight hours of watching my most recent K-drama, I was thinking about the food spreads, because there's always at least one food spread, if not many. And I'm looking at the kimchi, and I'm looking at the tofu, and I was like, hey, wait a second, where does tofu come from? So grab your soybeans, because we're jumping into this silky history. Tofu is actually kind of essentially soybean cheese. You start with dried soybeans, you soak them in water, then you grind them into a paste and boil that in water. The solids are strained away, leaving soy milk. Then you add a coagulant, something that kind of makes it curdle up or clump together. Traditionally, that might be nigari. It's a byproduct of making salt from the ocean, and it is filled with magnesium and chloride. It's used as, I think, like a seasoning, but it can make the clumps happen in the soy milk. Thus, the proteins begin to clump together into little curds. And genuinely, I watched this on the YouTubes. It looks just like making cheese curds. Then those curds can be collected, and depending on the type of tofu you're making, they are pressed to remove the water. So generally, the more water you remove, the firmer your tofu becomes, which is basically why you can walk into a grocery store and find soft, firm, extra firm tofu. And like the extra firm, you can like put on the grill, but the soft would fall through the grill. Silken tofu is made a little differently, but the basic principle is the same. You curdle up some soy milk, control how much water stays in the finished tofu, you enjoy a delicious treat. I didn't actually know this about tofu. I feel a little bit silly that it never occurred to me that it's just a matter of smush factor, but now we know. So how long have people been making smushed soy cheese? For roughly 2,000 years. Nobody knows exactly who, but there is a famous story of who invented it. According to legend, tofu was invented in China around the 2nd century BCE by a prince called Liu An. Apologies if I say that wrong. But this prince is the grandson of the founder of the Han Dynasty, and Liu An became known as a scholar and patron of philosophy and intellectual experimentation. According to the legend, he or one of his scholars were experimenting with soybeans when they discovered how to coagulate or make into curds the soy milk to the tofu. The problem is that the written connection between Liu An and tofu appears much later, so historians have kind of proposed a couple other alternatives. One idea is that tofu was discovered accidentally when mineral-rich salts were added to soy milk and caused it to curdle. There's also a theory that early Chinese tofu makers borrowed the basic idea of curdling from actual dairy-producing peoples in Central Asia. What we do know is that tofu became established in Chinese cuisine centuries ago. But tofu also had an interesting place in Chinese society. Confucian ideas emphasized social order and hierarchy, and food could reflect that hierarchy. So meat, which is expensive and very rich, therefore, was much more accessible to the wealthy. But tofu complicated things. It was cheap, therefore everybody could buy it. It was filling, it was versatile, and it could make textures and preparations that were surprisingly meat-like, and thus it picked up the nickname meat without bones. So tofu could cross those class boundaries in a way that a lot of foods couldn't, and it gave people some big feelings. At some point, those big feelings were handled, and then something happened that gave tofu a very useful audience. Can you guess who that audience was? If you said Buddhists, you get a golden soybean. because Buddhism became enormous and they were hungry. And this was kind of a story that really surprised me because I'd never made the connection. But when you hear that Buddhism helped spread tofu, it's easy to imagine a couple of monks in some remote monastery eating tofu for dinner, but nay. At various points in medieval China, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Buddhist monks and nuns. That was a lot. And just for reference, I did check how many religious figures there are in the US today, and it's actually around 370,000 across all religions. But we're talking about 260,000 of just the Buddhists, which is crazy to me. So, Chinese Buddhist monastic traditions increasingly emphasized avoiding meat because of the prohibition against taking life. So, monasteries needed foods that were inexpensive, filling, versatile, and didn't require killing of an animal. Hello, tofu. Soybeans could be stored, they could be grown relatively cheaply, and tofu could be cooked in an enormous number of ways. And so monasteries weren't necessarily the reason tofu became popular, but they became important centers of vegetarian cooking. In 845 CE, the Chinese Emperor Wuzong launched a major suppression of Buddhism. This isn't relevant for tofu, but it does give us a snapshot of how many Buddhist monks and nuns there were, because we knew that 4,600 monasteries were destroyed or closed, and roughly 260,000 monks and nuns were reportedly forced back into secular life. For comparison, I Googled how many religious figures across all religions there are in the US right now. That's 370,000. So with just one religion of Buddhism, they've got 2/3, 3/4 of all of the religious leaders we have in the US right now. Kind of crazy. And monasteries were connected. Monks traveled, pilgrims visited, lay people interacted with said monasteries and monks and nuns. So cooking techniques moved with people. And as Buddhism and other cultural exchanges connected East Asia, tofu traditions traveled too. So what about outside China? Well, exactly when tofu arrived in Japan is actually unclear. There are traditions that say monks brought it in from China as early as the 8th or 9th century CE. The earliest known Japanese written reference is around 1183, when something believed to be tofu appears in records from Kasuga Shrine in Nara. From there, tofu became increasingly associated with temples and, I'm about to slaughter this pronunciation, Shojin Ryori, Buddhist vegetarian cuisine, before spreading into wider Japanese society. And eventually, tofu became popular enough to get what I can only describe as its own 18th century cookbook moment. 1782, Japan published Tofu Hyakuchin, basically 100 tofu delicacies. Sidebar, I did see in a video that tofu was so popular in Japan at one point. Basically the equivalent of an ice cream truck or a tofu cart would go around town and people would come out with their bowls to get fresh tofu for the day. That was just a thing in the morning that people did. I think that's super cool. Anyway, back to 100 Tofu Delicacies book. People loved it. The book was successful enough that sequels followed, and it helped kick off a whole cookbook trend built around creating dozens and dozens of preparations for one single ingredient, which makes our modern image of tofu a little bit sad because this thing was lit. People were obsessing about it. But tofu also wasn't confined to China and Japan. Different tofu traditions became embedded throughout East and Southeast Asia, which brings us back to Korea. Because Korea developed one of the strangest tofu traditions I found during my research, because apparently when someone gets out of jail, you give them tofu. If you've watched enough K-dramas, you might have seen this. I don't know if I saw it myself. I'm going to pay more attention now. But why do people get tofu in the first place when they get out of jail? There are a few explanations. One is the color. Tofu is white, so it kind of symbolizes purity, innocence, and a clean slate, a fresh start, as it were. Basically, you went to jail. Now here's your tofu. Please don't go back because you are on your clean slate. There's another symbolic explanation I kept coming across, which is that the soybean, once transformed into tofu, cannot become a soybean again. And I just have to say, same with wheat and donuts. But I really like the meaning. There's also a practical explanation I came across, which is that during the Japanese occupation of Korea, lots of protesters were in prisons. Prison diets could be nutritionally poor. Tofu was inexpensive, soft, and is super protein rich, making it useful for someone coming out of prison in really poor physical condition. whatever the combination of symbolism and practical history that created that tradition, tofu after prison became recognizable enough that it appears in popular Korean culture today. Meanwhile, while enormous parts of Asia had been eating tofu for centuries, Europeans and Americans were still figuring out what the hell this cheese-looking block was. European writers encountered tofu centuries ago. In fact, Benjamin Franklin even wrote about it in 1770, describing what was essentially a Chinese cheese made from soybeans. And Chinese and Japanese immigrants were making and eating tofu in the US by the 19th and early 20th centuries. But outside Asian immigrant communities, tofu kind of remained obscure. And then we hit the 60s and the 70s. And suddenly, tofu finds its people. And we're going to call those people vegetarians, environmentalists, the natural food movement, the counterculture. People became increasingly interested in eating less meat and finding inexpensive plant-based foods. Books like Francis Moore Lapay's Diet for a Small Planet, published in 1971, helped introduce a huge new audience to the environmental and economic arguments for eating a more plant-based diet. Then in 1975, William Shurtleff and Akiko, I find that name so pleasing to say, Akiko Aoyagi published the Book of Tofu. And in that book, they explained how to make it. Thus, small tofu businesses began appearing, which is how we get to Germany in 1983. And we've got three guys, ironically, in an old butcher shop. One of those men is Bernd Drosihn. I hope I said that correctly. Bernd had actually discovered tofu while working as a saxophonist in the New York City area. He met a waitress who worked at a macrobiotic restaurant in Greenwich Village, became interested in the counterculture surrounding it, and was introduced to tofu. When he returned to Germany, Bernd and his friends formed a collective called Kollektiv Soyastern, which basically means collective soy star, and decided they were going to make their own tofu. There was just one small, itty-bitty problem, which is one, they didn't know how. So they experimented for months. They stirred vats of soy milk by hand, pressed tofu using stones until they finally figured out how to make a decent block. Then in 1982, they were selling tofu out of their car. A little dodge, I have to say. Not sure I'm going to be buying tofu out of someone's trunk. And then they found a permanent home. Again, butcher shop. The irony present. Inside said butcher shop, they even reportedly performed a purification ritual with incense, bless them, incense and candles before moving in to rid the place of animal spirits. But then they encountered a much bigger problem. German food regulations weren't prepared for tofu. At the time, soy milk and nagari, the coagulant used to make the curds for tofu, ran afoul of West German food regulations, which were heavily protective of traditional dairy products. We Germans, we do love dairy. So authorities didn't quite know what to make of this mysterious soybean substance. Like, literally, they didn't know how to spell it. Apparently, official documents have written it torfu, tufo, tofu, tortufo, tartufo, which is just endearing as all get out. So now we're in 1983. Police with, I can only guess, mustaches and no idea how to spell tofu arrived at the old butcher block. The tofu was confiscated. The collective received notice of a preliminary investigation into their crime. TORFU is the word they used. And the authorities kept coming. According to Bernd, they received prohibition orders from government offices around the country. The collective even nicknamed the officials trying to shut them down Fleischbeamte, which literally means meat police. And at one point, Bernd and one of his fellow tofu makers actually ended up in custody for a night. Apparently it wasn't super traumatizing because they kept making the tofu and they kept selling it, presumably out of the back of that car. And the legal fight over soy products continued until a court battle in 1989 helped break the regulatory blockade. But even then, our tofu outlaws had another problem. Nobody wanted their tofu. Might I suggest a different place to sell it than the back of the car? So they're running out of money. And they even went to court for financial help, showed the judge their product, and according to Bernd, the judge basically laughed at them. Then they discovered something that changed everything. They smoked the tofu. Thus, it was firmer, stronger, more familiar flavor, and people actually wanted to eat it. Smoked tofu became their breakout product, and the collective survived. The operation that police once tried to shut down eventually evolved into a major tofu business. Bernd went from having police confiscate his illegal blocks of tofu to becoming known in the German media as the Tofu King. So, next time you're standing in the grocery store debating whether you want to eat some tofu, just remember, everybody was tofu fighting, and now you can eat it fast as lightning. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.